No, I think we're all set.
Okay, the floor is yours. I'll go ahead and mute myself.
Yeah, I think it's special when we get one of our own board members to do a presentation, and so I'm excited about tonight because we have Joe Naylor, and Joe is our House and Grounds Chairman, but he's also, pretty much the jack of all trades. I mean, whenever we need something to get done, it seems like Joe has his hand up. So I just thank him for all his hard work. And I'm just going to give you a little intro tonight about Joe. Joe has a master's degree in computer science from the University of New Haven, and he had a career at the phone company as a programmer here in Connecticut. And fortunately for him, and unfortunately for me, he's retired now. That's where I'd like to be. But he's still so busy, probably busier than he was when he was working. After moving to Branford 40 years ago, Joe discovered that he had an ancestor who was one of the founders of Branford. And since that time, Joe has spent a lot of time researching this ancestor, who was named William Swain. And he's also, not only the person William Swain, but his role in the beginnings of Branford, and thus our title for tonight, Branford Beginnings. So I'll turn it over to Joe now.
Well, I want to thank you, Mike, for that.
Joe, I'm sorry, Joe, one other thing. I'd forgotten, and I should have said something about this. For those who are watching at home, if you're having any difficulty seeing the entire screen right there, I'd forgotten that on my laptop, there's a little thing at the top called View Options, and you can change your zoom ratio so that you fit it to window. It's just an issue with anything that's sent out like this. So I'm all done, Joe. You have the floor.
Yeah, I hope everyone can see the screens that I've put together. Well, once again, I wanted to thank Mike for that very generous introduction. I also like to thank the library for sponsoring these programs, and also for all the viewers that are here tonight, and especially Kathy and John Maturo for joining us tonight. About 40 years ago, my wife and I moved to Branford, and shortly thereafter, my father passed away, unfortunately, down in Washington, D.C., where I was actually born. And I inherited a family genealogical book. And as I was looking through the book, I was surprised to see an entry for one Elizabeth Swain, who was born in Branford in 1649 and died in Newark, New Jersey. Now, Branford was founded in 1644, so I figured, well, this is pretty interesting. I'd kind of like to, track this down a little bit about, how this all came to be. And that's one of the things that my talk tonight is about, is how I found out that I had an ancestor, William Swain, who was one of the founders of Branford. And not only that, he had a kind of very interesting story, how he started out in England and ended up in Branford, Connecticut, just a few years later, not that much later. I also wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what was going on in England during the time that leading up to Branford being settled, because at that time that basically the civil wars were going on in England, which I didn't know a whole lot about. I still don't, but they were kind of the background to what was happening in New England, and they actually played a direct role in things that happened in Branford, back then. So another point I'd like to make is in referring to the Native Americans in America, I prefer to use Native American, but in a lot of the old writings, they're talked about as Indians. So I hope no one's offended by that. I might, use the word Indians rather than Native Americans from time to time. But here goes. Here's my story, my ancestor story, I should say. Now, this seems like kind of an odd way to start a story about Branford, King Charles of England. But there's a lot of things happening back in England in the early 1600s. And most of us aren't very familiar with that time, but there was a lot happening and very interesting. And maybe I'll just name a few of the things, like Queen Elizabeth I died in 1602, I believe. Jamestown, Virginia was settled in 1607. The King James version of the Bible was first printed in 1611. Shakespeare died in 1615. The Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock in 1620, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded in 1630. So a lot of things were going on. Now, King Charles followed his father James, and he, along with the Anglican Church, were not very nice to the Puritans. There was quite a Puritan population in England at that time. King Charles believed strongly in the divine right of kings, and he also married a French wife who happened to be Catholic. And these things led to some problems between him and the Parliament, which he seemed to forget about some of the common law, and the traditions over centuries in England. But the persecution, which basically consisted of not allowing meetings, making meetings, Puritan meetings, illegal, and as much as possible breaking up those meetings, led to what is referred to, I hadn't heard this term before, but the Great Migration, the Great Puritan Migration. And so between the years of 1630 and 1640, approximately 20,000 Puritans sailed from England to New England, primarily to Boston and that area, seeking religious freedom. Now, the Puritans dressed simply. I mean, I'm sure you noticed that Charles was quite a snappy dresser there. The Puritans dressed simply, believing that the fancy English styles were sinful. But the Puritans basically wanted to purify the Church of England, the Anglican Church. They didn't want to break away completely. The Pilgrims wanted to break away completely and leave the Anglican Church. But the Puritans really wanted to just go back to more of a biblical oriented church and not have all the pomp and circumstance that still remained within the Anglican Church. Now, the English Civil Wars lasted from about 1641 to 1661, and they had a great influence on the story of how Branford came to be. Now, my ancestor, the Puritan William Swain, at 50 years of age, sailed with his family to Boston on the ship Elizabeth and Anne. And he was 50 years old at the time. His family consisted of two sons, Daniel and Samuel, Samuel being the oldest, and three daughters. So this is quite an undertaking to take at the age of 50, I thought. Mr. Swain lived in the town that's called Brentford, and it's in West London. He was wealthy and an influential Puritan. And in Mr. Swain's day, Brentford was sometimes spelled Brainford. So you might want to keep that in mind. But one of the interesting things about Brentford or Brainford was that Julius Caesar actually fought a battle there when he invaded England, back in the time of Julius Caesar. Now, when the Puritans, I should say the Puritan faith was really permeated in every aspect of their lives. They left England for religious freedom, but ironically, didn't extend it to others in New England. And there were Baptists, there were Quakers, there were Catholics in New England, but they were not treated well by the Puritans who settled, the area around Boston and Massachusetts. These Puritans were very conservative. They believed in a theocracy, that the church should control the government, everything concerning the governance of the colony. Now, Mr. Swain first settled in Watertown, which is near Boston. But in 1936, he journeyed to become one of the founders of Wethersfield in the Connecticut colony. And the difference between the Connecticut colony and the Massachusetts Bay colony was that many of the Puritans who were more liberal and more accepting of people with other religions were the ones who generally moved down into Connecticut. They actually believed in permitting people of other faiths or to participate in the town governments, which the more conservative Puritans did not. And what happened was that in Wethersfield there was a Wangunk tribe, and they offered cheap land to the English, hoping to enlist support with them against their enemy, the Pequot tribe. And they called these lands adventure lands. And William Swain and his family was one of the group of Massachusetts Puritans who moved down into Connecticut. You can see here the Massachusetts Bay colony with Boston here, and Wethersfield was approximately here in Connecticut. So they would have either had to go by land this way or go by ship around Cape Cod, down Long Island Sound and up the Connecticut River, which nobody knows which way they went exactly, but I tend to think they might have gone overland, and I'll talk about that later. So tensions between the English settlers and the local Native American tribes had developed it, by this time, and alliances between the English and the English and the settlers, the Puritan settlers, were constantly shifting, and the Dutch were also involved, but I won't go into that too much tonight. Some of the Native American tribes in this part of Connecticut that played a role in our story were the Pequots, the Mohegans, the Wangunks, the Quinnipiacs, and the Totokuts. Now, the Totokuts were the ones who lived in the area that's now Branford. The Quinnipiacs in New Haven, and the Wangunks, as I mentioned, lived up in Wethersfield, and they actually invited the English to come, and they sold them land very cheaply. They wanted their support, but the relations soon deteriorated because the English actually kind of pushed the Wangunks out of Wethersfield and took over the town, and they actually retreated down to Middletown. This caused some tension, and what happened? Well, first I'll show you a map of, this is a map of the Indian villages and um, trails in 19, I always want to say 19 instead of 16, but in 1625, before the English came. And I don't know if you can see this on your screens too well, but the point that the thing that struck me as so amazing about this map is that most of the original Indian villages and trails of that time are now towns and state roads in Connecticut. What happened was that most of the Indians or the Native Americans by this time had died from the result of European diseases such as smallpox, sometimes up to 90%. So many of their villages were deserted. And this enabled the English, or the Puritan settlers, to move into these villages that were already cleared. They had even had farming fields, that were ready to be used. And the trails were available, to travel from one village to another. And as I said before, most of these Indian villages and trails are today towns and state roads in Connecticut. Well, meanwhile, William Swain was on a commission of 4 men from Wethersfield, Hartford, and Windsor, which were the first 3 towns settled in the Connecticut colony along the Connecticut River. And this commission basically governed the Connecticut colony. It's interesting that this commission approved the colony's first constitution, which was called the Fundamental Orders. And this constitution was the first in the world to declare the foundation of authority is in the free consent of the people. This was the first document that, that stated such an idea, which is pretty amazing. And Connecticut is known as the Constitution State, also the Nutmeg State, which is another story, which a lot of you probably know already. But this is the Connecticut colony. And of course, it was named after the Connecticut River, which is basically the Algonquin word for the Connecticut River was Connecticut. It was basically the same as today. But these 3 towns were the first towns settled in the colony, and they were more a liberal, than their fellow Puritans in Massachusetts. The next thing that, I wanted to say that this was the flag of the Connecticut colony at that time. And the Connecticut flag today, with the 3 grapevines, represent the 3 oldest towns in Connecticut: Wethersfield, Hartford, and Windsor. And the Latin motto means, "He who is transplanted sustains." Now, the next big event that happened in my story is in 1637, a group of several Pequot canoes, maybe up to 100 or more Pequot braves, attacked farm workers in Wethersfield. Sorry. This was in April of 1637, and the Pequot raid on Wethersfield killed 6 men and 3 women who were doing spring planting. And one of the women killed was a daughter of William Swain. His other 2 teenage daughters were taken captive. And the Pequots then paddled down the Connecticut River, past the English fort in Old Saybrook, holding up clothes taken from killed planters mocking the English sailing ships. The English, seeing the captured girls in the canoes, couldn't fire on them. What eventually happened was that the Swain daughters were rescued by a Dutch trading ship captain and returned to Mr. Swain. And this Dutch trading ship captain later complained that this whole thing had cost him 10 pounds, and he never received the 10 pounds back from Mr. Swain, or even a thank you, which I don't know what that was all about. But the Pequot chief's wife had taken care of and protected the girls, so no harm really came to the girls. They were held captive, but they were cared for very well, and eventually returned to their home in Wethersfield. But in the meantime, William Swain and the commission declared war on the Pequots shortly after this raid in May. So only a month or less later, they declared war on the Pequots. And I should say that the Wangunks, who had originally invited the English to come to Wethersfield, had become kind of disillusioned and actually sided with the Pequots in this war. Now, this sign I just happened to see when I was visiting in Wethersfield, 3 or 4 years ago. They have a very nice, it's a beautiful place to visit, old Wethersfield. They have several old original houses and buildings, a very beautiful museum there, and library. But there was a house there that had this sign, and I guess it was the original house that William Swain lived in, and it was the home site of the captive Swain girls. So now that they had declared war on the Pequots, the 3 Connecticut colony river towns, Wethersfield, Hartford, and Windsor, raised a militia and pursued the Pequots. And they finally surrounded a village in Mystic. They set it on fire. I think it was in the nighttime when most of the Native Americans there, the Pequots, were asleep. Set it on fire, and between 400 and 700 Pequots were killed. And as they tried to escape, they were shot by the militiamen. And there's actually a movie about this event at the Pequot Indian Museum up in Ledyard that depicts this event from the Indians' point of view. But the Pequots were so horrified by such brutality, because that in their wars with other tribes, they never did anything like this. They might, as they did in Wethersfield, they killed 9 people, which is of course terrible and a tragedy, but they never went to this kind of wholesale massacre, that the English executed in Mystic. So as a result, the remaining Pequots, these were mostly actually women and children in this village at the time, and the other Pequot warriors or men fled the scene and fled along the coast of Connecticut. And one of the outcomes of this, first of all, they were finally caught in Fairfield, around Fairfield, Connecticut, and most of them were killed. The ones that weren't managed to escape and joined other Indian tribes, and of course they weren't all killed, but a good portion. And in fact, the chief was beheaded, and his head was sent back to Wethersfield. And I should say this wasn't all that uncommon in that time. Even the Pilgrims did this sort of thing. And one of the reasons why they did it, it was proof that the chief was actually dead. They didn't have newspapers in those days or television. So it kind of, besides being very scary and horrifying to people that saw this, it was also proof positive that the chief, of the tribe was dead. But while they were going along the Connecticut coast, this was in 1637, they noticed that there was a goodly land along the Connecticut coast that seemed like it was a good place, probably to settle. They said it was pleasant land that would make a good plantations. Now, one of the militiamen was John Plum of Wethersfield, who was later to become town clerk of Branford. So this is all pointing towards the settling of Branford. But the other things, word got back to England, I'm sure, and the New Haven colony was settled in 1618 and Guilford in 1639, independently of what was going on in the rest of the Connecticut colony. But this section of what is now Branford and North Branford was left unsettled. So I'm sure John Plum, when he went back to Wethersfield, reported on all this that he had seen. Later on, what happened in Wethersfield was that there were two factions. Apparently, there were two different ministers who managed to attract people to their, two different congregations. One was more liberal than the other, which, as I said before, meant that they were more open to allowing people of other faiths to live in their towns, to take part in the town government. And so there was a bad situation that developed in Wethersfield in the early 1640s. And John Davenport, who is one of the founders of the New Haven colony, which was a very, very conservative colony, came up to Wethersfield to help settle this dispute that was going on there. And he recommended that the more conservative group form a settlement in Totoket, which was between New Haven and Guilford, and they were kind of anxious to have that, that section of land settled. And so they invited the more conservative group in Wethersfield to come down, and that was just happened to be led by Mr. Swain, William Swain at that time. Now, the New Haven colony had purchased Totoket in 1639 from Monowese, who was chief of the Totoket tribe, for 11 coats. We all know the name Montowese, those of us from Branford, of course, because there's Monowese Avenue, it's a common name around town. But the New Haven colony bought this whole section of land for 11 coats. And at that time, there were only 11 braves and their families remaining in the Totoket tribe. The rest had died from European diseases. Now, Mr. Swain traveled from New Haven down to New Haven and purchased Totoket for his Wethersfield group of 35 families. Now, he paid 12.5 pounds, which was about the cost of a house at that time, for the purchase of Totoket, this area that's now Branford and North Branford. And the Totokets had agreed to live in the Shoreline Peninsula to be called Indian Neck. And it was a reservation, one of the first in our country. This, I'll point out here, Indian Neck, as you can see, is this peninsula. This up here is the town of Branford. There was kind of a marsh over in this area, so that really the only practical way for the Indians or for the Totoket tribe on Indian Neck to get to town was to cross the river by canoe. Now today, Indian Neck is one of the most desirable sections of Branford to live in. So it wasn't like it was a big punishment for the Totokets to live there. In fact, they had been living there during the summer and warm part of the season for hundreds of years. And not only Indian Neck, but Stony Creek, all along the coastline, and basically having what I would describe as a clam bake, you know, a really nice time on the shoreline, a beautiful area, as you can see from this picture. And not only that, in the 1800s, there were approximately 10 hotels along the coastline of Indian Neck, and it was a popular vacation area for people from New York and from the more northerly parts of Connecticut, including Mark Twain used to come down, you know. But in the meantime, William Swain was leading about 35 families from Wethersfield down to Totoket, to this area between New Haven and Guilford. A few of these, probably the men from this group, drove their livestock overland from Wethersfield down to Branford. And I used to wonder, how in the world did they do that through trees and the wilderness? But it turns out that there was a very, I would say, sophisticated system of roads in Connecticut. And I've had it described to me that, well, he probably would have come down what's now Route 5 and then maybe down Route 20 right into Branford, you know, leading their livestock. But most of these families came down by boat on the Connecticut River. They would have come down the river around the Sound and up the Branford River to what we now know as Branford. There was one minor snag that I'm mentioning this for Matt Radulski especially, since he lives in the area that I'm going to talk about. There was one Thomas Mulliner who had already acquired a homestead from the Totokets. When he lived there, it was called Mulliner's Neck, but it's now called Branford Point. And it's a beautiful area right on the Branford Harbor with beaches, you know, very lovely place to live. But it turned out that both the settlers and Mr. Mulliner both owned the same property. And he turned out to be a thorn in the side of the settlers. He was often in court in New Haven, where they had the more serious issues in the court in New Haven for trespassing and for not showing up for militia training run by Captain Samuel Swain. But could you blame him, really? He also was helpful to the settlers with carpentry work. He was an expert carpenter, and he even made a sign for the King's Highway, which was the road between New Haven and Guilford. Now, at first, these 35 families built simple wooden houses around the town green, what they set up as the town green. They also built a 5-mile long wooden fence, 4 feet 2 inches high, with 5 rails around the entire town, from the harbor all the way around the town to the Branford River. And Branford is the only town in New England known to have ever done anything like this before or since, I guess. And now, was it for keeping wolves out or cows in? I don't know. But I don't think it would have kept the Indians out or bears. But it certainly probably would have kept their cows from straying. Now, Mr. Swain was one of 5 men chosen to settle town disputes. And here are some examples taken from the actual town records of the time. And as I said before, John Plum was the first town clerk. And we have this wonderful resource in Branford. In the town hall, they actually have the handwritten records from back in 1644, 46, for the next 100, going on as far as you want to read. But the very first records are so tiny. The handwriting is beautiful, but so tiny it's very hard to read. And in the 1920s, the owner of the MIF company had these records transcribed, and they're now in beautiful leather-bound copies in the Blackstone Library. And when you read them, written by people who actually lived at that time, it just puts you there. It's just amazing. You can just feel what it was like, living at that time in Branford in the 1600s. And I've pulled out 3 or 4 examples of some of the disputes. These are kind of the little more unusual ones, but for example, Goodwife, and I've some of these I've written word for word from, with the spelling and everything from the original records. Now, Goodwife Robbins says Mary Dodd is a wanton girl. Now, Mary was judged to be guilty and was to be whipped by her father in the presence of the judges. And there was a backstory that I won't go into too much. It was a little spicy and a little surprising, to find in, the handwritten records of the, the town clerk. But it seems that the Goodwife Robbins felt maybe with some reason that Mary Dodd had an eye on her husband. Now, there was also a 10 p.m. curfew. The punishment was a 12 shilling fine or a whipping if you were out past 10 o'clock at night, unless you had a very good excuse. And there was a place called Whipping Post Hill, which stood where the Baptist church now stands. And I should say at this point that the green in Branford was not as flat, not the flat, beautiful grounds that we know today. It was a little more hilly and rough then. And there was an actual hill where the Baptist church now stands. Now, Sam Rose was fined 5 shillings for selling strong liquor to the Indians. Another one was, whoever shall take away any man's canoe, be he English or Indian, shall pay 5 shillings, and for taking a paddle, 6 pence. Now, the Totokuts needed those canoes. They needed them to cross into town. They traded with the settlers and helped them hunt bears and wolves, for which they were paid bounties. There was a 20 shilling bounty on a bear, a 12 shilling bounty on a wolf, and on and on. And there were always friendly relations for the most part, between the settlers in Branford and the Totoket Indians. In fact, the Totokets depended on the settlers to help defend them from some of the more warlike tribes that surrounded the area. One of the things that they did actually was create wampum from the large quahog shells, which were large clams, I should say. And it was a very labor-intensive process to make the beads, the purple beads from the quahog shells that were colored purple. And they actually used these beads to, in effect, kind of pay tribute to other more warlike tribes to prevent them from invading them. This is a map, a street map of Branford in the early 1600s. The yellow lots belong to the Swains. I just had to throw that in. The town green as well, green, as you can see. I'll use my cursor here. It was still the same shape as it is today. It was used then mainly to graze the sheep. Main Street comes down here. At that time, it was known as the King's Highway and was originally an Indian trail, which stretched from New York to Boston, I should say, or maybe, and probably further than that. And this street was now Monowee Street, was then called Town Street. William and Samuel Swain lived up approximately where Darbar's Indian restaurant is now. Daniel Swain lived on the green. What the town council did then was to appropriate, or to give, I should say, 2 to 3 acre lots around town for homesteads, and then other fields out beyond the fence for grazing cattle, raising corn, planting, that sort of thing we'll get into later. Now the church, oh, I forgot, I'll go back. I won't. The church at that time, there it is. The very first church that was built, it's now the Congregational Church, then the Puritan, it's called the First Society in Branford, was built on the corner of what now is the cemetery. I'll go to the next screen. The church was a log building about 40 feet square, surrounded by an 8-foot stockade fence. And 2 men stood guard during the church services to protect against Indian raids, not from the Totokuts, who were peaceful, but there were sometimes raids from whatever Pequots might have still been, left in the area, the Mohicans, and sometimes even the Mohawks from upstate New York. Now the town name was soon changed from Totoket to Branford. And some of the early documents spelled the name Brainford. Now, just out of curiosity, I tried to find out where all of the 35 families that settled Branford were originally from in England. And it turned out I could only determine about half of them, and they were spread all over England, from Wales to Sussex, east to west, north to south. And the Swain family was, as far as I could find out, was the only family from Branford, England. So I think that they might have had something to do with this change from Totoket to Branford. And so we now live in the town of Branford and not Totoket. Now the early settlers were mostly farmers. They grew Indian corn, some wheat. They had gardens, they had cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens. They drank beer and hard cider, even the kids, because they couldn't trust the water. They had bad experience with water in England, with cholera, diseases. And when I read that even the kids drank beer, I wondered to myself, I could just picture all these kids stumbling around, bumping into each other, drunk on beer. But it turns out, I read in another source that they heated the beer and the cider before giving it to the children. But they ate well, they liked the beer, and well, they liked having lots of kids. While the children helped with family chores, and they worked very, most of the time, I would say, in those days, everyone spent most of their day working. But the children did have some time to play. I couldn't resist this one picture over here that I found on the internet with the kids blowing bubbles through the long clay pipes, tobacco pipes that were used at that time. And they probably did, but it would have been obviously easy to make seesaws, that type of thing. The hoops, I should say, hoops and stick were popular. I couldn't understand what would be the big appeal about that, but it turns out that there were all kinds of games that they could play, races, obstacle courses, competitions that they could, play. Also, they could do the same games that kids do today. Hide and seek, jumping rope. And there was even an accounts of the kids playing church, setting up little church services, which was kind of surprising considering the length of church services on Sunday that they attended. Now, there were also some shipbuilding and maritime trade. Branford had the best natural harbor between London and New Haven. They traded up and down the coast of up and down the coast of Connecticut, of course, Long Island. They went to the Caribbean, Jamaica, mainly to train for rum. As I said before, they appreciated their alcohol. The Puritans. That's one of the things that they did do. Now, this is kind of a strange picture, but I'll explain it in the next slide. They actually had part-time paid jobs from the town. They were usually paid salaries in bushels of corn. They were usually for a year. They had a drummer to call people to church and to other town meetings. And if you were late, you were fined. Now, this drummer also collected at a half an hour before sunrise. He went around with a drum and he collected cows from all the settlers. They kept their cows in their town homesteads at night, but during the day they went out to fields outside of the town limits. Now, a townsman was also hired to inspect the 5-mile fence. Each family was responsible for a section of the fence, and fines were fined if the fence was not maintained properly. And another interesting thing was one fellow had the job of keeping the young boys behaved in church. And as I said before, I had some sympathy for the boys because the church services went on pretty much all day Sunday with a break for lunch, and town people actually set up huts on the green where they could go to get warm and eat something because the church wasn't heated at all. Now, one of the very important events that happened in Branford was Abraham Pearson came to Branford from Southampton, Long Island in 1646 to serve as minister of the First Society, or the Congregational Puritan Church. And he served for 21 years and was a very powerful influence on the town. He was also very conservative, believed in theocracy, the town controlling everything. The church had great power. An example is that they alone could buy or rent land from the Totoka tribe in Indian Neck. And over the course of the next 75 years, the church bought pretty much the entire land in Indian Neck. The town said it had been divided up into farms for the Native Americans, Totokuts there. Now, when the church purchased these farms from the Totokuts, they then rented them out to the, excuse me, let's get this out of the way. They rented them out to townspeople, for farmlands. And that was to support the church, for the support of the church. Now, the Reverend Pearson was a very intelligent man. He actually wrote a partial dictionary of the Totokat language. He wrote a catechism called the Helps. He attempted to convert the Totokuts, though without success. I must say he did convince them that it was a good thing not to work on Sunday. So he did convince them to rest on Sunday. Another interesting thing was that he presided over the only witch trial in Branford. I hope I'm not going too long. I'll describe that very briefly. There was a young boy in town, a teenager, who was out of control. He apparently had fits, which makes me think that he probably had epilepsy, but people thought that he was possessed by the devil. And he was brought to trial. Abraham Pearson presided. This was all described by the eminent Puritan minister and a historian, Cotton Mather, who also wrote extensively about the Salem witch trials. But this boy confessed to his transgressions. And according to Cotton Mather, he was physically lifted by the devil and thrown into a pigsty, and the pigs all ran away squealing from the boy. The boy climbed the fence and ran into the woods, and that's where the story ends. So unfortunately, we don't know what happened to this young lad, but it actually is a sad story when you think that I think anyway, that he was probably had epilepsy. Now, Abraham Pearson was a strong advocate of theocracy, as I said before, and he organized the upheaval of Branford to come later in 1677. Now, before long, the settlers were building colonial homes similar to the ones being built in Boston, because wood was plentiful in New England. Now, in these houses, it was common to have an open hearth furnace for cooking and for heating. You see some of the other implements for grinding corn, candles, bread dough, etc. But it was said that, or some say today, that you could cook anything in a colonial open hearth that you can cook in a modern kitchen, which is probably true, because it's amazing. There was a built-in oven also to the side, usually for baking bread. And you could move things around the coals, at different distances. There were implements for making waffles, for making toast. It was quite interesting. The only thing you couldn't make was microwave popcorn, but they did make kettle corn, and the Native Americans showed them how to make popcorn. The early settlers had to spin their own wool and flax. The large one is called the great or walking spinning wheel. The small one was the flax wheel. It had a pedal. You had both hands free to work. And then there was the ninny-nanny, which was the winding tool, for keeping the wool or the thread straight, and also for determining how much you had. I think it was 2 yards to go around once. But this was something that children could help with, winding the yarn around the ninny-nanny. But a colonial wife, it was said, could walk 20 miles in a day working the grate or walking spinning wheel, because you walk back and forth, you pace back and forth as you were doing the spinning. There were also looms for weaving linen and wool, and also linsey woolsey, which was a combination of the both of them both. Now it took 2 months of labor, it was said, to produce one linen shirt. Now the settlers grew their own flax plants to spin, to thread. They had sheep that they kept behind the house in the village for wool. And the colonial families usually only had 2 sets of clothing, one for work and one for Sunday church services. And the linen clothing was so durable and sturdy that it was often passed down from generation to generation. It was a very good material. And of course, it was also used for bedspreads and that. Now, this is something that still exists in Branford today. I think, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but it was the site of the first bridge and tidal mill over the Branford River. It's close to the bridge that goes over the road to Pine Orchard Road. And Samuel Swain, to get back to the Swain family, was given the job of building a bridge and a tidal mill over the narrowest point of the Branford River, which I think that we just saw. And there was a toll for a full wagon, and that was 5 pounds. For an empty wagon, it was 20 shillings. And I presume that the much higher toll for the full wagon was because that bridge wasn't all that sturdy, probably. So it's taking some risk, crossing it with a full wagon of produce. Now, the road over the bridge led to Pine Orchard, which was then called World's End. And you could still only get to Indian Neck by canoe or rowboat, just because of the way the river bent at that point and the large marsh there. And it was decades before a bridge to Indian Neck was built. Now, all this while, the English Civil War was still raging between the Roundheads and the Cavaliers. And it was the parliamentarians were the Roundheads and the monarchs were the Cavaliers. Now, when I saw these pictures, I thought, well, the Roundheads under Oliver Cromwell got their name from the round helmets, but it turns out, as I read further, it was because they cut their hair short. So maybe they were kind of like the skinheads of today. I don't know. But in reading a little bit about Oliver Cromwell, he was a Puritan, and he was considered a military dictator for about the 8 years that he was in true power. And one of the things he did was to invade Ireland. And history says that he actually murdered about 1/4 of the Catholics in Ireland at that time. So that's a very sad story in history. In 1949, King Charles was captured and beheaded. It was the first time in English history that a king had been executed by his own people. But in 1658, Cromwell died, and the English people by this time were tired of the warfare. They longed for the monarchy and order in the country. And in 1661, after Cromwell's death, a couple of years after, Charles II returned from France with his Portuguese wife, Catherine. He became the English king, restored the monarchy, and this was to have a great impact on Branford. For King Charles II in 1666 decreed that New Haven, the New Haven colony, which included Branford, would come under the authority of the Connecticut colony. And as you recall, the Connecticut colony was much more liberal than the New Haven colony, including Branford. And in 1667, Reverend Pearson, who didn't want to be under the liberal authority of the Connecticut colony, persuaded half the people in Branford, including Samuel Swain, to sail to New Jersey, where they founded New Ark, or Newark, New Jersey. Samuel's brother Daniel remained in Branford, and his two sisters, one married in New Haven, the other in Guilford. But Samuel Swain became a prominent citizen of Newark. They actually have a statue of him there. And his 19-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, who I first read about in this genealogy book, was the first to set foot on shore there. There's a plaque on the riverbank commemorating her. And if you don't mind, I just want to read what's on that plaque. It's not long. It says, Elizabeth Swain, the daughter of Samuel, was the first to land on the shore of Newark, having been merrily handed up the bank by her gallant lover, Josiah Ward, who she shortly thereafter married. But Branford quickly recovered from the loss of half her families. With half the town's homes and farms now vacant and up for sale, new settlers came, and many again came from Wethersfield. Now this, you have to remember, this was the second or third generation. And as you also recall that many of these Puritan families had 10 or 12 kids. So there was a great need for homes and farms, I'm sure, at this time. So like I said, Branford was soon back up to the population that it had before this. Another thing that happened was in 1700, a group of 10 ministers met at Reverend Samuel Russell's house in Branford to found a college. And this college became Yale University. Now, Abraham Pearson's son was also named Abraham, who grew up in Branford and attended Harvard, was the first president of Yale University. Now that is the ending of my talk. Today, I just wanted to mention that the Branford Historical Society maintains the Harrison House as a museum and provides tours and school programs. Our website is here if you'd like to copy it. And as Matt mentioned earlier, please consider joining. Thank you very much. And I guess now we'll have questions.
Yes, if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and type them into the chat, and I'll be moderating, and hopefully we get some more interesting info. All right, someone wants to know, why did Branford lose half of its families?
Well, they went to Newark. What happened was New Haven, which included Branford at the time. Branford was under the authority of New Haven. Because of the decree by Charles II in England, became part of the Connecticut colony. And the Connecticut colony was much more liberal in their outlook, on how they treated non-Puritans, how, the way they ran their government. And so the minister in Branford, Abraham Pearson, persuaded half of the town to leave Branford. They sailed down the Long Island Sound and founded Newark, New Jersey. They had actually made a deal with the governor of New Jersey and got the land very cheaply, but they actually founded Newark, New Jersey, which is pretty interesting. And so that just left a lot of empty houses and farms in Branford, which were quickly purchased by people from different parts of Connecticut.
Somebody wants to know, does any part of the original fence still remain?
That's a good question. There is a post in the barn behind the Harrison house that is supposed to be part of the original fence. And I think it was in the Blackstone Library for some period of time. So one post remains from that fence.
And Joe, if I can add to that, Blackstone Library had a big museum with all sorts of interesting historical items, old firearms, really an eclectic display for years. And that was turned into the Children's Museum during a renovation years ago. That's all.
Let's see. There are several signs in the Branford Green celebrating the founding of Yale University, but Yale states that the founding occurred in Clinton. Would you care to comment on this controversy?
I'd love to. As I said before, Abraham Pearson, he was actually the third, but we could say junior. He was the son of the minister who was in Branford for 21 years. What happened was 10 ministers met in Branford at the home of Samuel Russell. The house was right next to the cemetery today. They met to form a college for Connecticut, and it was to be called the Collegiate School. Now, Samuel Swain Jr., who at the time was living in Greenwich, I think, was chosen to be the rector or president of this new college. And he came up to Killingworth, Connecticut, and for the first 7 years of the college, it was actually, the classes were taught out of the home of Abraham Pearson in Killingworth. Then classes moved over to Old Saybrook and Clinton for a period of time. And it was then decided maybe that was too far out, in the boondocks or something, and it was decided that the college was going to be moved down to New Haven. And there was, this created a terrific conflict between the towns of Old Saybrook and New Haven at the time. But eventually the college was moved down to New Haven, of course, where it's been ever since. And eventually, now the story of how it got the name Yale, I don't know if you want me to go into that, but it's kind of funny because one Elihu or Eli Yale, who Yale is named after, left Massachusetts at the age of 18 months. He went to England with his family, and he later became, he worked for the English company. I'm trying to think of the name of it. But anyway, in India, and he was actually the governor of Madras in India, and he became very wealthy, and he was kind of a crook. I hate to say it. He basically gained a fortune from the Indian people that were under his jurisdiction. And he was also rumored to have been involved in slave trade. But anyway, one of the ministers knew him or his family somehow, and they wanted to get money, to build this university. They contacted him, and he could, and they promised that they would name the school after him if he gave him some money. He gave him 800 pounds and some merchandise and maybe some books and things to help start this university. He never gave anything after that, and he never set foot in Connecticut. But they did name the school Yale University. And they're still known as the Elis. I hope that answered the question.
So we have a couple different questions about the Tutucket tribe. Are there any still around? How long did they live in Branford for after settlers arrived?
Yeah, I need to say more about that because basically from the very beginning of Branford, when the Puritan Church, the first society, it's now the Congregational Church, bought land from the Indians and then rented it to farmers, for the income went to the support of the church. within about 75 years, they had virtually bought the entire Indian Neck section. And there were very few Totokas left in Branford, just a handful, maybe working for other, for farmers, lived in town. But within 100 years, I would say there were virtually no Totoka Indians left living in Branford. So.
Someone else has a question. They want to know how you conduct your research and where do you find all these original documents and
I wanted to talk about that because
trade secrets.
When I thank the Blackstone Library, one of the first things I did after finding that I had this relative, well, I don't want to say relative, ancestor, and as Lloyd Buzzle reminded me, you can't pick your ancestors. But I joined the Historical Society right away because I wanted to find out more information. And a lady by the name of Janet Gaines was the president. And there was no internet in those days. And she was tremendously helpful in finding documents in the library, in the Blackstone Library, about my ancestors. So that was wonderful. And now there's just so much on the internet that you can find out, with ancestry.com and about all these historical figures. It's just amazing. And it's a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed the talk. I hope it wasn't too long, but I just had so much fun. I've never done anything like this before, but I had so much fun putting together this slideshow and getting, a lot of the pictures were I just pulled off the internet. There was the one picture of the two little Puritan kids blowing bubbles, and I just had to stick it in there because it was so cute. But yeah, there's just a tremendous amount on the internet that you can, research that you can do. That helps.
For sure. Do you know why North Branford split from Branford?
Yes, absolutely. What happened was it was a long carriage ride down from North Branford to Branford to go to church. And you were required to attend church, or you were actually fined money for being late, or certainly not for being there. And so eventually the people living in North Branford requested or made the request that they form their own church in North Branford. And that permission was given, they did, and they eventually decided to form their own town. And as opposed to Guilford, which, you have Guilford, you have North Guilford, the same in Madison, but here in Branford, the people in North Branford felt strongly enough about it to want to form their own town government, and they did. So that's how that happened. Basically, because it was such a long carriage ride down to church on Sunday, it was just very difficult. Okay.
Let's see. Are there any incidents of piracy along the Branford coastline?
I don't know of any incidents of piracy, but of course, a lot of people know this story, and I was going to put it into my slideshow, but I had to leave a few things out. In the Thimble Islands, there's a wonderful group of islands off the coast of Branford called the Thimble Islands, and the Indians also occupied these islands during the summer. They just had a very good time of it. The Totokas in the summertime in Branford. But there's one island, it's called High Island, and there's a little harbor that's in the middle of this long, high, it's a very, very high cliffs that you can go, pull a boat into and hide. And it was, well, Captain Kidd actually did, I'm sure, use this, to hide and as a base of operations. So there was rumors that he buried treasure there. But people from Branford have searched now for maybe 400 years. They haven't turned up any treasure, but they did have, Captain Kidd did used to hide his ships, his tall ships, in the Thimble Islands.
What's the oldest standing house in Branford?
Yes, that's a good one. And I maybe there's somebody else that could help me. It's not the Harris.
Joe, Matt Rudolsky here. Let me jump in.
Go ahead.
So one source that I found on that shows that the John Tyler House at the corner of Mill Plain Road and the Kings Highway Route 1 was built around 1710, and that's still standing. We know the person who lives there.
Yeah, Bob.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
However, the Tide Mill House in Harbor Street, which was a very heavily trafficked road between the harbor and the center of town, that's reputed that the early parts of it were built around 1663, that there was a mill house there. And to go along with that, there was an archaeological dig led by a professor from UConn. And they did find some European artifacts from the 1600s from then. But that would be my quick answer.
Yeah, I was going to mention too that the Dutch were also in Branford before the settlers from Wethersfield. They built a fort apparently on Indian Neck, but they were mostly here to trade, not to form colonies, not to bring families and have farms and settle. They were here to trade for furs with the Indians, which they did.
Right, you beat me to that. We had the Dutch fort down by what's now the Onego Inn, and we had a Dutch wharf where, of course, we have Dutch Wharf Marina. Going along with that, they also, fascinating talk a few years ago about that excavation of the Dutch fort, about how they were cutting a certain type of oak to make barrels for shipping dried codfish and other fish to Europe, because up in Maine, where they were fishing for that certain fish, they'd run out of the right type of oak. They only had the wrong type of oak. So the Dutch traded from Connecticut up to Maine in order to get the right type of barrel staves for that. But I won't get too detailed, but you have the floor again. Go ahead.
Oh, no, that's quite all right. No, go ahead. But no, like I said, the Dutch mainly, one of the main things that they did was to trade with the Native Americans for furs, for beaver furs, and that type of thing, because apparently they were used for these big tall hats that were worn in England at the time. Okay.
All right, I see we have time for probably one more question, I would say. Someone in the chat said they recently learned they're related to the Tylers. And can you tell us anything more about the Tyler family specifically?
I will hand that one over to Matt if he could help out with that, or maybe if Jane Booley is on the call.
She won't be able to unmute. Can you go ahead and repeat the question, please?
Someone just wants to know more about the Tyler family, if they just found out they're related to them.
Oh, there's so much about them. That's one of the early families here, like the Rose family. When they mentioned Sam Rose being punished for selling liquor to the Indians, as a phrase went there. Of course, they've just opened Rose Vineyards. That's the same family. They're North Branford now, but that was, of course, part of Branford. And the Rose family was one of the first founding families of Branford. So I guess the family tradition continues with alcoholic beverages. So Jenna, if we're out of time, I'm going to ask Joe actually if we have so many more great questions coming up. Maybe we ought to do something like this in another month or so, just kind of a free form thing. So I'll work with Mike and Joe, and we can send out an announcement. It'll depend on your schedule, of course, but I know that you've got a clock ticking there. So I'll just sum up here, Jenna, if we're supposed to finish up. Thanks to all the attendees for being here. Mike, thanks for setting this up. Joe, multiple thanks to you for a great presentation. I'm going to keep pushing membership in the Branford Historical Society, because we do things like we entertain all the third graders in Branford. in the after times, after the pandemic at Harrison House to get a sense of colonial life. That's all I have to say. Mike Russo, the floor is yours.
Well, if I could say one more thing,
Oh, Joe, go ahead.
as with everyone, we've all suffered during this COVID crisis for the past year, and including our historical society. So we could really, really use the help, anywhere we can get it, and especially, for, getting new members. That would,
Yeah, Joe, I would agree. And I would encourage everybody to check our website, and that will tell you how you can become a member. Joe, it was a wonderful talk tonight. I've gotten a lot of positive feedback in the comments and questions that I'm reading here. And I just want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. It was I must say it was a lot of fun preparing. I hope people enjoyed it.
Oh yeah, it was super interesting.
Yeah.
All right, then I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. And like I said, we'll have a recording available in a couple of days. So if you miss anything or want to send it to anybody, we'll make that available to you soon. Have a good night.